I have 75% of the oil that the United States needs to use. I have 85% of the gas the United States needs. It is an ecosystem that has been nourished, most recently, by the North American Free Trade Agreement, by NAFTA. Similar, let's go to Europe. Who do you guess is Germany's largest trading partner? Remember, one of the measures of globalization is that your largest trading partners are your neighbors. Who would you guess? France. And in answering that question, I gave you the answer to the next question. Who do you guess is France's largest trading partner? Germany. So again, it's one of the interesting and peculiar phenomena of globalization is much of what we call globalization is really regionalization. And that, by the way, may be a key to understanding one of the major changes that has been occurring in Asia, in your part of Asia in particular, before the crisis, but especially as a result of the crisis, which is the growing presence of regional trade. And in that regard, not only within ASEAN, but also, of course, ASEAN plus 3, and of the 3, most notably China, that trade has been growing very, 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 very rapidly. And it may be one of the unintended consequences of the Great Recession of 2008 is the restructuring of trade into patterns that look more familiar to what we see and have long seen in North America and in the European Union. In part, that's also why these economies, Mexico, Canada, etc., are so quite large. But notice also on this list that we have a rather wide geographic dispersion of that next tier, what is often referred to as the rest, that next tier. It is not just Asian economies. We have economies in the Middle East, most notably Iran. You could add Turkey to that list, but whether you consider Turkey in Europe or the Middle East is a political answer to a larger question. You will see, of course, it also includes Central Europe, of which is not just Poland, but depending upon where you are politically with regard to Turkey, Turkey would fit on that axis as, actually axis is not a good word to use these days, but on that line as well. You would see, of course, other parts of the European Union, most notably Spain, Europe's 5th largest economy, though itself in, under tremendous pressures as a result of this crisis. You would see, of course, to add to the China, India, Japan nexus, you would add now Indonesia and Korea and Taiwan into that story as well. The point here is the relative changes that are occurring in Asia are also happening to other large, emerging, in fact, well beyond emerging, middle to upper middle income economies of some consequence. And at least collectively, using this particular exchange rate, you can see that the top 20 economies represent well over 3/4 of world wealth. If I make that a market rate, that 3/4 becomes 85% in the top 20 economies. What's interesting is that using the PPP rate or using the market rate, while I'll get different rankings of countries, the names are all the same in the top 20. But their relative rankings change rather dramatically. But also think of who you don't see on this chart, not just who you do see on this chart. I suspect some of you might have thought Saudi Arabia could perhaps be on this chart. Highly unlikely. It typically is in the high 20s and low 30s. High 20s when oil prices have spiked up, low 30s when oil prices collapse. You'll notice that we've yet to encounter a single economy out of Africa. If we had, it would be South Africa, very likely, and if not South Africa, then Nigeria, very likely. But Africa is always a complicated story because 3 out of every 5 Africans come from either Nigeria or Egypt. But that's the population mix, not the relative wealth mix. You'll also see that you won't find other economies located in Latin America for a very simple reason. Latin America is Brazil. And if it's not Brazil, then it's Mexico. The average Latin American may speak Spanish. The average South American my father would always say quite proudly, would speak Portuguese. That is that Encarnation name she was trying to say earlier is a Portuguese word. But what I want you to see is that below the top 10, below the level of the BRICS and the other traditional advanced industrial economies, we get a very wide distribution of wealth around the world. It's not just in Asia. Indeed, the Asian phenomenon repeats itself in a few other geographies as well. Let me end with two slides, this one on with trade. On the left-hand side, I've tried to look at merchandise trade. I'll talk about services in a moment. This is trade in goods. And I've ranked the top 12 economies and 12 traders in this particular instance. I'm focusing on trade because trade has emerged both as a major opportunity for economies trying to come out of this crisis and as a major problem. After all, we're talking these days about exchange rates and about exchange rate wars, largely because of the way those exchange rates affect trade. Germany is historically, and has been for the last 3 decades, the largest exporter of goods. In 2009, this is a 2008 number, China actually passed Germany by a marginal number. The preliminary numbers for 2010 is that Germany, of course, has roared back. Whenever I hear someone use the phrase factory to the world, I always assume they mean Germany. And I'm shocked to discover they might mean a China or some other place like that. Possibly so, hadn't thought of it myself, because Germany typically appears at the top of the chart. And if you look at the recovery in Europe today to the recession of 2008, it is the German economy that is leading what small recovery we have there, and within Germany it is not domestic demand that is leading it, it is foreign demand. After all, where do those Chinese factories producing final goods get their machinery? The largest export market for German machinery this year is China. That said, China still doesn't surpass France as Germany's largest trading partner, but China certainly is of growing importance to German exports. What I want you to see is those top 3 exporters, Germany, China, and the United States. And by the way, the United States has been on that chart ever since we've gathered these kinds of data, as has Germany. China's the newcomer to this. Those top 3 exporters account for 1/4 of world trade. Trade, like wealth creation, is highly geographically concentrated. It's also very region-specific. The amount of exports from Iceland to Malaysia is limited. Most trade is intra-regional trade. Again, your largest trading partner typically is your neighbor. It is not true, however, for economies often in this region. Take, for example, India. India's largest trading partner is not Pakistan. India's largest trading partner is not China. For some odd reason that I've never been able to figure out, when you shoot at each other, it seems to not accelerate trade. In fact, India's had trouble globalizing in part because it doesn't have the natural advantage that we see in North America and Western Europe to being able to expand beyond your borders to your neighbors and therefore deepen your economic interdependence in that way first before engaging in a larger trading pattern with the world economy. What I want you to also see is that trade is very critical to growth. The top 4 exporters on this planet also happen to be the top 4 economies. And that's true even in economies such as the United States, where trade is typically 10 to 15% of GDP, but typically more recently in the 10% range. But remember, it's 10% of a very big number. And thus, the U.S., even on merchandise trade, always appears in the top 3. If I put services trade up there, the U.S. would appear as number 1. Again, a relatively small percentage, but a small percentage of a very large economy. And also, by the way, if I put services up here, you would find that in 2008, India joined this top 12 list. On the right, I want to illustrate that India is likely to join the top 10, top 12 list of traders, not just within services where it already excels, but in manufactured goods as well. What I've done on the right-hand side is just try to say, let's try to understand the trajectory that India and China are on. China liberalized almost a decade before India, so you've got to expect that there's some lagged effect. And many of you, I'm sure you've seen these kinds of studies. The best I've seen is one done by Morgan Stanley, where they basically superimpose exports in this particular instance, and these are total exports of goods and services, as a percentage of GDP. With the 0 year being the year at which we began our reforms, though on a calendar basis they would be very different years. And what's amazing to see is how highly correlated these movements are. And indeed, the sharp downturn you see in China is the downturn as a result of the Great Recession of 2008. The downturn that you see in India is that same Great Recession, but of course happening at a different point in time in its reform effort. By the way, at an earlier time, you can see China being adversely affected, of course, by the financial crisis that you experienced in this part of the world in 1997 and 1998. The point here very simply is that trade is an extremely important piece of this recovery story that we are seeing unfold before us. It is extremely important in your part of the world because it helps to explain why this part of the world recovered much more quickly than did, say, advanced industrial economies, Japan, the United States, and the European Union. And the big change in Asia has been the growth not of increased trade with the United States or the European Union. After all, consumption and investment in those economies has been declining. It's actually been intra-regional trade, stimulated in large measure by China. China shifting from being a heavily export-dependent economy to ones whose imports as a percentage of GDP are growing very rapidly. And I'll remind you what these imports are. These are not necessarily Gucci bags going to Chinese consumers, though that may be occurring as well. These are those high-speed trains. These are those major infrastructure investments across a whole number of transportation platforms, from railroads to airports to you name it, that the Chinese are undertaking. Again, China has turned the problem of the recession of 2008 into an opportunity to seriously upgrade its infrastructure. I have two boys, and I often tell them that in life is double entry accounting. For every asset there's a liability, for every liability there's an asset. The liability of this recession of 2008 is something that China has tried to convert into an asset by galvanizing expenditures around infrastructure that is needed for future growth, and doing so as a way to stimulate domestic demand in the short term, but achieving long-term investment needs as well. The second part of the story, in addition to trade, is a story around productivity. Now, this is hardly the first time Asia has been in a debate around concerning productivity. But I'm often asked, what are the three things that matter most for long-term growth? And I said, well, the three are, it's absolutely critical in these three to get the order right. The first one is productivity. The second one is productivity. And I'm guessing you've thought of the third one already. The third one is productivity. We often think of growth and productivity as sort of, at times, competing objectives. Certainly companies often think of them as competing objectives. Yet, to my mind, they're opposite sides of the same coin. And let me see if I can